For 23 years, Rosa Medina folded sheets in the basement of St. Agatha's Memorial Hospital without ever once going upstairs. Then, on a Tuesday morning in November, she pulled a blood-soaked gown from the laundry chute, read the patient tag, and felt the floor disappear beneath her feet, because the name on that tag was her son's. Rosa Medina had what most people in the neighborhood called a quiet life, and she wore that description the way a woman wears a coat that doesn't quite fit, gratefully because it keeps out the cold, but always aware of where it pulls and pinches. She was 54 years old, silver-haired before 50, with hands that had seen more hot water and industrial bleach than any pair of hands deserved. She worked the early shift at St. Agatha's Memorial Hospital in the laundry processing unit, a department buried so deep in the building's lower level that the fluorescent lights hummed with a slightly different frequency than the rest of the hospital, as though even the electricity down there had been separated from the world above. She arrived every morning at 5:45, punched her card at the yellowed time clock beside the break room, pulled on her rubber apron, and began the process of sorting, washing, drying, folding, and bundling the hospital's endless river of linens, gowns, towels, and surgical drapes. She had done this for 23 years. She had done this through the birth of 2 grandchildren, through the death of her mother, through 2 hurricanes and a pandemic, and the slow, grinding dissolution of her marriage to a man named Eduardo, who had eventually chosen rum over responsibility and disappeared into the Florida heat. She had done all of this, and she had kept doing it, because the job paid consistently, because her supervisor, Mrs. Hargrove, was fair and occasionally kind, and because the basement of a hospital, strange as it sounds, had come to feel like the safest place Rosa knew. Nothing unexpected happened in the basement. Sheets came down dirty. They went back up clean. That was the entire contract, and Rosa honored it without complaint or variation for more than 2 decades. What people who haven't worked hospital laundry don't understand is that it is, in its own grim and intimate way, a deeply human job. The linens that come down the chute are not abstract. They carry the residue of people's worst moments. The fever sweat of a child, the surgical blood of a stranger, the slow leaking of bodies that are giving up. Rosa had learned early not to think about this too carefully, because thinking about it too carefully was how you ended up crying into a washing drum at 6 in the morning, which helped no one. Instead, she had developed a kind of professional numbness, a practiced distance from the evidence of suffering that passed through her hands every single day. She sorted by color. She checked temperatures. She ran the machines. She folded with precise, economical movements. She did not ask whose blood this was, whose sweat, whose fear. She was not unkind. She simply understood that her job was the laundry, not the story behind it, and that preserving that boundary was how she stayed intact. She had one rule for herself, one personal line she had drawn sometime in the early years and never crossed. She did not go upstairs. Not to the patient floors, not to the cafeteria on the 3rd level, not to the administrative wing. She took her breaks in the basement break room. She ate her lunch from a container she brought from home, sitting at a plastic table beneath a motivational poster that had been faded by humidity into near illegibility. When her shift ended, she walked directly to the parking structure and drove home. The hospital above her, the beeping monitors, the rolling gurneys, the families clustered in waiting rooms with paper cups of bad coffee, existed in a separate world, one that she was adjacent to, but not part of. She told herself this was healthy. She told herself it was how she protected her peace. What she never fully admitted, not even to her sister Consuelo, who asked occasionally with careful eyes, was that the real reason she never went upstairs was that she was afraid. Not of illness, not of blood. She had made her peace with both of those. She was afraid of recognition. She was afraid of going upstairs and seeing, in one of those beds, someone she loved. And so she stayed below, and she kept the floors between herself and that fear like layers of insulation. And she believed, as people who are managing dread always believe, that what you don't see cannot hurt you. She was wrong, of course. She had always been wrong about that. But it would take a blood-soaked gown and a name printed on a hospital wristband to teach her so. And on the morning that lesson arrived, it arrived with the full, merciless weight of every year she had spent convincing herself that distance was the same thing as safety. Her son Marco had not called her in 4 months. She had told herself he was busy. She had told herself he was fine. She had told herself a great many things in the basement of St. Agatha's Memorial Hospital, standing beneath humming fluorescent lights, surrounded by the laundered evidence of other people's emergencies, and she had believed all of it, right up until the moment she didn't. It came down at 8:17 in the morning, which Rosa would later be able to say with absolute certainty because she had just glanced at the industrial clock above the sorting table when she heard the familiar pneumatic thump of the laundry chute releasing a new load. The sound was ordinary. Everything about those first few seconds was ordinary. She crossed to the chute with the same automatic efficiency she brought to every task, pulled on her gloves, and reached in to begin the sort. The gown was on top. It was an adult male surgical gown, size large, soaked through with blood that had already begun to darken at the edges from bright red to rust brown, the way blood does when it has had time to meet air and start the slow work of changing its mind about what it is. AB negative. The blood type was printed on a sticker attached to the accompanying wristband tag, standard protocol at St. Agatha's for patients whose type had been confirmed and flagged for transfusion readiness. AB negative was rare, roughly 1% of the population, and Rosa knew this not because she was medically trained, but because her son Marco was AB negative, had been since birth, a fact his pediatrician had mentioned with the mild gravity of someone delivering news that is important to remember, and which Rosa had stored in the part of her memory reserved for things that might one day matter in an emergency. She read the blood type. Her hands slowed. Then she read the name on the wristband tag still attached to the gown, and her hands stopped entirely. Marco Medina, DOB 03-14-1991, admitted 11:07, room 412. The gown fell from her hands. She did not remember dropping it. She remembered the sound it made, a wet, heavy sound, the sound of something that had been holding itself together, losing the effort. And she remembered the way the break room suddenly felt very small, the walls pressing in with a quiet, relentless patience, as though they had been waiting for this exact moment for 23 years. She stood at the sorting table for what felt like a long time but was probably 12 seconds, and in those 12 seconds she experienced, in rapid and disorderly sequence, denial, recognition, terror, and something else that she would later describe to her sister as feeling like the entire structure of her chest simply falling open. Then she ran. She ran through the basement corridor, past the linen folding stations and the dry cleaning alcove and the little office where Mrs. Hargrove sat with her scheduling spreadsheets, past the time clock and the motivational poster and the plastic table where she ate her lunch in careful, protected solitude. She hit the stairwell door with her shoulder and took the stairs 2 at a time, and somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd floor, she began screaming her son's name. Not loudly, not the way people scream in movies, but in a low, fractured, repeating way, like a person trying to call someone back from somewhere very far away. Marco. 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 By the time she burst through the door onto the 4th floor, 2 nurses were already moving toward her, and a security guard was reaching for his radio, and Rosa Medina, who had not been upstairs in 23 years, who had organized her entire adult life around the principle that what you don't see cannot touch you, was standing in the middle of a hospital corridor in her rubber apron with tears running down her face, and the absolute devastating knowledge that the distance she had built had never protected anyone, least of all her son. He looked smaller in the bed. That was the first thing Rosa thought when the nurse finally led her through the door of room 412, after they had confirmed her identity and called up his records and established, with the careful, bureaucratic gentleness that hospitals deploy in these moments, that yes, she was listed as next of kin, yes, she could go in. Marco Medina, 33 years old, looked smaller than she remembered him, and Rosa's last memory of him was already 4 months old, a brief, strained Sunday visit where they had eaten reheated rice at her kitchen table and talked around everything that mattered until it was time for him to leave. He had been big then, or she had remembered him as big, broad in the shoulders, heavy with the particular physical confidence of a man who had spent years using his body as both a tool and a shield. In the bed, connected to monitors and an IV line and a breathing tube that rested under his nose, with dried blood still visible in a cut above his left eye that had been closed with butterfly strips, he looked like something that had been taken apart and reassembled slightly wrong. The woman sitting beside him was not someone Rosa recognized immediately. She was perhaps 60, well-dressed in a dark blazer with a hospital ID badge clipped to the lapel, silver-haired in the precise and deliberate way of a woman who has made peace with what her hair decided to do and made it look intentional. She was holding a Bible, a well-worn one, the spine cracked with use. And she was holding Marco's hand, and she was speaking to him in a voice too low for Rosa to hear from the doorway. Something quiet and rhythmic that could have been prayer, or could have been comfort, or could have been simply the act of talking to someone so they know they are not alone. She looked up when Rosa entered, and her eyes were calm with the particular calm of someone who has sat in rooms like this one many times and learned how to be steady in them without becoming cold. "You must be his mother," the woman said. Her name badge read, Sister Catherine Voss, Pastoral Care. "He's been asking for you." Rosa crossed the room in 3 steps and took her son's other hand, and Marco turned his head, slowly, with visible effort, and looked at her, and something in his face changed, the way a house changes when someone finally turns on a light inside it. "Mom," he said, and his voice was rough from the breathing tube they had removed an hour earlier, and it was the most ordinary word in the world, and also, in that moment, the most extraordinary. Rosa sat down in the chair on his right side. Sister Catherine remained on his left, still holding his hand, her Bible open on her knee, the room arranged around Marco's bed like a small and unlikely parliament of the people who had arrived here for him. The monitors beeped, the candle on the bedside table, someone had brought a candle and flowers and a rosary and a photograph, flickered with the barely perceptible draft from the ventilation system. Outside the window, the November afternoon was grey and quiet. "What happened?" Rosa asked, because she didn't know yet and she needed to, the way you need the outline of a thing before you can begin to understand it. Marco closed his eyes briefly. Sister Catherine's hand tightened slightly on his. There was a story here. Rosa could see the shape of it in the cut above his eye, in the tattoos on his neck and hands that she had not known about, in the 4 months of silence before this morning. And it was not going to be a simple story, or a comfortable one, and some parts of it were probably going to hurt her in ways she wasn't prepared for. But she was here now. She was upstairs. She had broken the one rule she had kept for 23 years, and the world had not ended. It had done something more complicated and more important than that. It had given her back her son, battered and attached to monitors and wrapped in a hospital gown, but present, breathing, asking for her. She held his hand, and she waited for him to be ready to tell her, and she thought about all the years she had spent below, staying safe, and she thought about how safety and love are not the same country and how she had confused them for so long. Rosa stayed in room 412 for 11 hours that first day. She went home briefly at midnight to shower and feed her cat and call her sister Consuelo, who cried on the phone for 10 minutes, and then began making plans to drive down from Orlando. She was back at St. Agatha's by 6 the next morning, not in the basement but on the 4th floor, in the chair beside Marco's bed, with a container of home-cooked food that the nurses gently told her Marco couldn't eat yet, but that they would be happy to put in the break room refrigerator. She had called Mrs. Hargrove the previous evening and explained in the straightforward way Rosa handled most things that her son was in the hospital and she would need to take her accumulated leave. Mrs. Hargrove, who was fair and occasionally kind, told her to take whatever she needed. The story Marco told her came out in pieces over 3 days, the way stories that have been held in silence for too long always come out. Not in a clean, organized narrative, but in fragments, interrupted by sleep and pain medication and the periodic arrival of nurses checking his vitals. The broad shape of it was this. Marco had been involved, for the better part of 2 years, with people who operated in the margins of legal commerce, running errands and providing transportation for enterprises that Rosa understood without needing the details spelled out. He had been trying to get out. The injuries that brought him to St. Agatha's were the consequence of that attempt. A disagreement that had become physical in a parking lot in Hialeah. 3 men. A confrontation that Marco had not walked away from under his own power. He had been found by a stranger who had called 911. He had been brought to the nearest hospital, which happened to be St. Agatha's Memorial, where his mother had spent 23 years in the basement without ever once coming upstairs. Rosa listened to all of this without interrupting, which cost her more than Marco probably knew. There were moments when she wanted to stop him, to say, "How could you?" or "Why didn't you call me?" or "Do you know what it cost me, not knowing where you were?" But she held those words back, not because she didn't feel them, but because she understood, sitting there in that room with the monitors and the candle and the rosary on the bedside table, that what Marco needed from her right now was not accounting. He needed what Sister Catherine had given him in those hours before Rosa arrived, the simple, stabilizing presence of someone who was not going anywhere. The accounting could come later. The questions could come later. Families are long projects, and there was time. Sister Catherine visited twice more during Marco's recovery. Rosa found herself watching the woman with quiet attention, trying to understand what it was that she did, what the precise nature of her gift was, because it was clearly a gift. The way she moved through a hospital room with no apparent agenda other than to be present and human in it. On her 3rd visit, Rosa asked her directly, the way Rosa asked most things, without prelude or softening. "How do you do it?" she said. "Come in here and sit with people you don't know, when they're at their worst, and just hold steady." Sister Catherine considered the question for a moment, looking at Marco, who was sleeping. "I don't hold steady," she said finally. "I just don't leave." Rosa thought about this for a long time. She thought about it on the drive home. She thought about it in the weeks after Marco was discharged, when she was helping him navigate the practical catastrophe of his situation, the legal consultations, the relocation, the slow and unglamorous work of rebuilding a life from the materials available. She thought about it when she returned to work in the basement, which she did because the job still paid and Mrs. Hargrove was still fair, and Rosa was still the woman who showed up. But something had changed in the basement too. She noticed things she had trained herself not to notice. She thought, when the chutes opened, about the people attached to the linens coming down, not morbidly, not in a way that undid her, but with a quiet, deliberate acknowledgement that these were people, that the blood and the sweat and the fever soaking into hospital cotton all had names attached to them, and that the names mattered. She had always known this. She had simply spent 23 years deciding not to know it. She didn't stop going upstairs after Marco was discharged. That was the change that surprised her most. Not the dramatic rupture of the morning she ran up the stairs screaming her son's name, but the quieter habit that followed it. She took her lunch in the hospital cafeteria on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She learned the names of the nurses on the 4th floor, who recognized her and waved. She occasionally sat with Sister Catherine in the pastoral care lounge and drank terrible coffee and talked about things that didn't need to be resolved, which was new for Rosa, who had always believed that a conversation without a conclusion was a conversation wasted. She was learning at 54 that some of the most important things people do for each other have no conclusion. They are simply the ongoing act of not leaving, of staying, of being, as Sister Catherine had put it, the kind of person who doesn't go back downstairs just because it's safer there. Rosa had been that person once. She was becoming a different one now, not without effort and not without grief for the years she had spent insulating herself from the very life that had needed her, but with the particular resolve of a woman who has done hard work her entire life and understands that the hardest work is not always the kind that shows on your hands. Marco called her every Sunday now. Sometimes the calls were short. Sometimes they talked for an hour about nothing in particular. Rosa kept the calls, regardless of length, in the part of her memory reserved for things that might one day matter in an emergency, except she understood now that this was exactly the wrong way to categorize them. These calls were not emergency preparedness. They were not insurance against future disaster. They were just life, ordinary and ongoing and available if you were willing to come upstairs and meet it.